Well, welcome. We couldn't have a more fitting Founders Day speaker a few days before our actual Founders Day on November 10th, especially as we are focusing on the theme of civic virtue during a 3-year celebration of our college's 250th anniversary that will culminate next year. It was the emerging republic's need for civic virtue that inspired Samuel Stanhope Smith to pen the college's mission to form good men and good citizens in the fall of 1775 as he was preparing to open the college to its first students. Our speaker, Jeffrey Rosen, is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. He is a graduate of Harvard and Oxford, and he earned his law degree at Yale University. He is also a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. He hosts We the People, a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. Mr. Rosen's most recent book, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America, underscores the founders' belief that the pursuit of virtue, or the desire to be a good man and a good citizen, is the pursuit of happiness. And it is that pursuit of virtue and happiness that is the basis for successful government of the self. And it is successful government of the self that is essential to the self-government required in an effective and successful republic. The first chapter of Mr. Rosen's book makes one of the best cases I have seen or read for the existence of Hampden-Sydney College and our distinctive and important mission. I encourage all of you to read his book, and particularly that chapter with our college's mission in mind. There are copies available, and we will be happy to sell them to you, and Mr. Rosen will be happy to sign your copy after his remarks. I want to extend my appreciation to the sponsors of tonight's lecture. In addition to my office, the 250th Anniversary Commemoration Committee, the Wilson Center for Leadership in the Public Interest, to the Departments of Classics, Government and Foreign Affairs, and History, all contributed to make this night possible. We're grateful that Mr. Rosen has spent much of the day here with us on the Hampden-Sydney College campus, participating in classes and meeting with students and faculty members. We're now excited to hear a very relevant message he has for us as we gather to celebrate the 249th anniversary of Hampden-Sydney's founding.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen of Hampden-Sydney, hello friends. It is an honor to be here with you in this historic and beautiful room, standing in front of a plaque with your college motto shining behind us, forming good men and good citizens. And as your president said, I discovered through an unusual COVID-era reading project that forming good men and good citizens is the founders' definition of the pursuit of happiness. They believed that personal self-government is necessary for political self-government. And unless we achieve virtuous self-mastery in the constitutions of our own lives, we can't achieve the same virtuous self-mastery in the constitution of our republic. So I want to tell you about this reading project. It came about completely unexpectedly. It changed my understanding of how to be a good man and a good citizen, and it makes me all the more enthusiastic about your inspiring mission and how it will transform your lives and give you a lodestar about how to live moving forward. So here's how this happened. It was during COVID that I discovered that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson took as their definition of the pursuit of happiness a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And here's how it happened. First, I was reading Ben Franklin's autobiography, which you've got to check out if you haven't read it yet. There's that section where he describes how in his 20s, he decided to achieve moral perfection. And he makes a list of 12 virtues that he later expands to 13. And they include some of the ones that are listed here. Temperance, prudence, order, industry, frugality. He saves the one he finds hardest last, and that is humility. He then makes a list of the virtues on the x-axis and the days of the week on the y-axis, and every week he decides to focus on a different virtue and to put an X mark in the box when he's fallen short. He tries this for a while. He finds it's incredibly depressing because there are so many X marks, and he gives it up, but he thinks he's a better person for having tried. Now, what I discovered during COVID is that his motto for the project was that Cicero book, the Tusculan Disputations, and it said, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville on the UVA campus. And in the room is this poster of a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson drafted for his daughters. His virtues look a lot like Franklin. They include resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Silence, when angry, count to 10. When very angry, 100. Jefferson leaves one of Franklin's virtues off his list. Maybe he didn't want to raise it. It's chastity. But what really struck me is that when Jefferson is asked when he was old, what's the secret of happiness and how can I achieve these virtues? He also would offer a passage from this Cicero book, the Tusculan Disputations. And it's longer. Jefferson copied it out when his dad died to console himself. It's from Cicero's manual on grief. And it says, "He who's achieved tranquility of soul, who's neither unduly exuberant or unduly desponded, he is the calm and self-composed man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man." So I thought, okay, I've got to read this Cicero book because it was so important to both Jefferson and Franklin in their definition of happiness as virtue, not as feeling good, but as being good. A definition that I hadn't thought of before. But what else to read? Then I came across this amazing reading list that Jefferson would send to lots of people who wrote to him when he was old and asked them how to be educated. He'd send this to kids who were thinking of going to law school. He'd send this to his friends who wanted to be lifelong learners. It's an amazing list that struck me both for the breadth of the reading and also the schedule that Jefferson prescribes. So here's what he says you've got to do. You've got to wake up before dawn. From dawn to 8, you begin with physical sciences and then turn to moral philosophy. And what caught my eye were the books of moral philosophy on the list. Starts with Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and then Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Stoic, and Greek and Roman moral philosophers, and then Francis Hutcheson and John Locke and David Hume and Bolingbroke. So you start with the moral philosophy. Then from 11 to noon, you read political philosophy, and the two books that Jefferson recommends are Locke's two treatises and Sidney's Discourses on Government, which reinforces the urgent importance of your celebrating and being inspired by your history. Sidney's Essays on Government contains a passage about the need to recur to first principles in order to preserve the principles of a republic. And George Mason quotes Sidney in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which says that a frequent recurrence to the first principles, in particular the virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice, is necessary to sustain a free society. So that's how important Sidney and Hampden and other great revolutionaries' idea of virtuous self-mastery and maintaining government by consent is to the founders. Back to Jefferson, then you're allowed some lunch. After lunch, you read English and American history and also the natural sciences. Then dinner, then you're allowed some Shakespeare and some poetry for light entertainment, and then to bed. But this is 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, no breaks. I don't know what got into me, but I decided to follow the schedule. So during COVID, I woke up every morning before dawn. I read the moral philosophy for 2 hours a day. I watched the sunrise, which is the most beautiful thing you can possibly experience I found. And then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom of the moral philosophy that I'd encountered, which I know sounds incredibly weird. And I'd not written sonnets before, but there's something in the harmony and symmetry and beauty of the philosophy that made me want to sum it up in sonnet form. And a friend of mine who runs a Shakespeare theater had posted a YouTube video about how to write a Shakespeare sonnet, and it's easy meter, and you could just do it. So that's what I did. I did this for a year, and it just changed my life. It transformed my understanding of how to lead a good life. And I came to understand the wisdom of the ancient insight that happiness consists in self-improvement, self-mastery, character improvement, being your best self, using every moment of the day to overcome your unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, so you can achieve the calm tranquility that defines self-mastery, which defines excellence, which defines virtue, which defines happiness. Perhaps some of you have encountered now Aristotle's famous definition of happiness, an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. The terms virtue and excellence aren't self-defining, so that's not familiar to us today. It comes from eudaimonia, good demon or good spirit. But I now came to understand after reading the wisdom that the idea of virtue has to do with self-mastery, and in particular, you see repeatedly this antithesis in all of the wisdom between reason and passion. That distinction turns out to come from Pythagoras, of all people, who in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, also was a guru who lived on the island of Croton and encouraged his disciples to first be good and then live like gods. And the way that you achieve that godlike self-mastery, embodied in Pythagoras' phrase, reverence thyself, is to not be distracted by unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, and to use your powers of reason, which Pythagoras locates in the head, to overcome your unreasonable passions or emotions in the heart and desires in the stomach, so you can achieve calm self-mastery. And Plato popularizes that into his metaphor of the charioteer. The charioteer is reason. There are two horses. One is noble and the other is appetitive. One is pulling up and the other is pulling down. And the charioteer reason ensures that they're all pulling in the same direction. And it was Pythagoras who recommends that system of nightly self-accounting that Franklin got from him, and suggests that by every night, taking a close accounting of how you've done in not losing your temper, in achieving temperance, in being composed, in being focused, in not being distracted by those unproductive emotions, you can slowly become more and more perfect. And Pythagoras is also very big on moderation in drink and diet. He's a rigorous vegetarian. He takes this to great extremes. All vegetables, with a big prohibition against eating beans. And he's so serious about this that his disciples were once being chased by the enemy, and they came across a bean field. And the enemy soldiers say, "Just tell us why the heck you don't eat beans and we'll spare your life." And the soldier said, "I'd rather die than tell you the secret," and spits out his tongue and perishes rather than reveal the secret. Why the heck wouldn't they eat beans? Well, the philosophers disagreed about this. Some say it was because beans resembled fetuses, and the spirit of life is in them. Others suggest that they tended to make their presence felt from another orifice, so it was one or the other that apparently inspired Pythagoras, but no beans, otherwise vegetarianism. But there's this great passage in Ovid's Metamorphoses, book 15, which describes Pythagoras' view that total self-mastery in eat and drink and schedule was important for living a godlike life. And it was all part of self-discipline and self-mastery. And using every moment of the day mindfully, which is why the founders, all of them, are so keen on daily schedules. The Jefferson schedule was not unusual. So many of them are making lists and accountings of how they're spending their time. How I spend my time was a frequent lament, and they're focused on clocks and eating and exercising at the same time of day. Jefferson has all sorts of advice about hikes, which he thinks are crucial, and what you should bring with you, and don't bring books, although you can bring guns. Jefferson said hunting is okay, but you got to just stay focused on nature. And basically the whole goal is to get outside of your head so you're not distracted by anxiously worrying about the future or thinking back to the past, but you're totally tuned in and utterly able to focus and give yourself to the present moment. The philosophy is rooted in the Stoic dichotomy of control. Don't focus on things you can't control, like the thoughts or emotions of others, or external activities, or who's going to win an election or a war. Focus on the only thing you can control, which are your own thoughts and emotions. And John Adams noticed the extraordinary similarities between the Stoic wisdom and the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita, of the Hindu tradition, which says we are what we think, life shaped by the mind, and renounce attachment to external events, and enjoy eternal bliss and salvation. But then Adams is not sure whether the Bhagavad Gita has been translated. There's a translation that this guy Joseph Priestley is working on, and he's not sure Priestley's lived to complete it. And he writes to Jefferson, and Jefferson says, "Good news, he lived, I'll send you the translation." And Adams is so excited because he thinks that this will show that the great wisdom traditions of the East and the West, including Christianity and Judaism, all embrace what he sums up in his own mature creed: love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. All rooted in this complete philosophy of self-mastery and individual perfection. Not only the opportunity, but the obligation, the responsibility every day to become as perfect as Jesus and Socrates, as Franklin said, and to try, recognizing that we're going to fail, to become more perfect. And I found this to be an extraordinarily empowering philosophy for how to lead a good life. I remember when I was in college in the 80s, it was the greed is good decade, and there was, pop culture was celebrating materialism and hedonism and sex, drugs, and rock and roll and all that stuff. And I was looking for an alternative to that kind of unabashed materialism and hedonism. I was an English major in college. I was studying Puritanism. And I had great teachers of Puritanism, but I have to confess that Puritanism was not doing it for me as a philosophy for how to lead a good life, because there are just not a lot of options. No amount of good works will save you if you're not the beneficiary of, randomly given grace. Plus, I'm Jewish, so that was another problem. And I wanted an answer to the question of whether you could lead a good life by reason, reflection, rather than pure religious authority. And what I didn't realize is that this is exactly the question that the ancients had set out to answer, and that had been embraced at the time of the founding by all of the traditions that inspired the Declaration. The Stoics, the civic Republicans like Hampden and Sydney. Hampden uses the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, as do the Christian sources like Wollaston and Tillotson and Samuel Johnson, the American preacher who wrote the curriculum for the University of Pennsylvania and uses the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, repeatedly. And the Enlightenment sources like John Locke. One of the exciting things about doing research today is that all the sources are online. And it just blows my mind that I could do all this reading just sitting at home on my couch. And through word searches, I was able to see that all of the phrases, the sources I've just discussed, use the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, and they all define it as virtuous self-mastery, not the pursuit of pleasure. It's just everywhere. It's hiding in plain sight. And Samuel Johnson's dictionary from 1755 is the standard source for what words meant then. His definition of the pursuit of happiness, there are two definitions. One is the Old English definition, hap or luck, but the modern definition is essentially virtuous self-mastery, overcoming desire so you can achieve calm tranquility. And the citation is to John Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, book 55, which is where I found the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. So it's just remarkable that this central definition, which was so familiar for all of American history and was taught in schools and was absorbed by high school kids and college kids and law schools and adults, just fell out of the curriculum, and that's why it was so exciting to discover it. This book sets out to tell the stories of the founders. Biography is the best way of learning about history, and I wanted to find out, how did the founders live these values or not? As kids, they studied the importance of virtuous self-mastery. Did they live up to their ideals or not? I wanted to get into their minds and relate to them and understand things from their point of view. And what was so striking is that they talked constantly about their efforts to achieve self-mastery. They're writing about it in their diaries, they're making their daily schedules, they're constantly beating themselves up for not being virtuous or industrious enough, for squandering their time or wasting their talents, or wondering if they're making a hash out of it every day, the way I certainly do and did, and always trying to work harder. They're aware of their hypocrisies. They talk very candidly about them, including slavery, which I'll mention more about in a sec. But they are utterly modern in their psychological candor of their efforts to lead good lives and be better people. And they think that it's very relevant to their happiness. So what you're doing here in trying to be good men and good citizens at the same time was their central task. They thought about that all the time. And it was reflected both in their political psychology and in their constitutional arrangements. I start the book with John and Abigail Adams. They're so great as examples because they're both raised in this Puritan tradition, and they're constantly talking about their own efforts at self-mastery. When they date, they decide to make a list of each other's faults. And they get this from Pythagoras. They were reading Pythagoras' Golden Virtues. They've just met, and they think, what better thing to do than to make a list of each other's faults? Not a great dating strategy, I have to share with you. They barely survive because John Adams is the most famously arrogant and self-regarding man of his age. The musical 1776, he's always singing about, I'm obnoxious and disliked. And everyone thinks he's so pompous when he wants the president to be called His Elective Majesty, that they mock him as his rotundity, and basically he's got an ego problem. But Abigail very deftly says, well, you're so brilliant that some people might think you're intellectually intimidating. You know, she puts it very nicely. And he says, well, you should practice the piano more and you should read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. So she's, wow, indeed. So she says, well, I'll try to practice the piano more and read more, but a gentleman should not comment on a lady's posture. And they survive that, and they go on to have one of the great romantic and intellectual partnerships and friendships of all times. And their letters are so inspiring because they're real letters of equals. They're constantly trading examples of their own attempts to be virtuous. Adams, ever since he was in college, and read Burlamaqui, is always saying that he should work harder and be more industrious. Abigail, her favorite proverb is, he who is slow to anger is greater than he who conquers a village. That's the Old Testament version of virtuous self-mastery. And they embody all of this philosophy and moral emphasis on character in their son, John Quincy. And if I had to pick a favorite founder in all of the amazing men and women in this book, it would be John Quincy Adams, because he so mindfully lives the wisdom of the duty on a daily basis to achieve moral perfection. So here's his story. His parents are constantly telling him to work harder and be more perfect and be more tuned in and more focused. I thought having a Jewish mom was hard. Having a Puritan mom is even more difficult, because Abigail would not get off his case. And he is bristling always, like, stop nagging me. You know, you're always telling me I'm not doing enough. At the age of 32, he's just turned down a US Supreme Court appointment. He's the minister to St. Petersburg, and he's writing in his diary, you know, if only I had more self-discipline, I might actually make something of my life. He said, if I could just achieve self-mastery, I might have ended war and slavery. He sets a very high bar for himself. But as it is, I'm spending too much time at the theater, I'm drinking too much, you know, I've got to just buckle down and make something of myself. Well, he goes on to have an extraordinary career. He's elected president in the contested election of 24 against Andrew Jackson, but then two tragedies strike. He loses the 28 election, and then his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. And the son can't take the pressure of being, imagine having the name George Washington Adams, and Quincy writes these letters from a Christian father to his son based on his own very close reading of the Bible. They're learned and deeply powerful, but imagine the pressure of getting that from your dad. He descends into alcoholism and he jumps off a steamship. And Adams is crushed. He doesn't know how he's going to continue. His world has dropped out from him. What does he do? He spends a year rereading his favorite book, Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, that same book that Jefferson and Franklin cited. And he takes from that book what becomes his motto: I plant seeds for the benefit of future generations. He doesn't think that his achievements will bear fruit immediately. And then he goes on to reinvent himself as the greatest abolitionist of his age. And it's just an amazing story. He wasn't a big opponent of slavery before this moral transformation, but he comes to conclude that it violates the Bible and natural law. Based on his close reading of the Bible, which he also reads daily in the White House and afterward, there's a passage where Jesus promises to free the captives, and Adams sees this as a prophecy for the end of slavery. And he goes on to denounce slavery in Congress, where he's elected from Massachusetts, the only former president to return to Congress. He introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. He denounces the gag rule, which forbids the reading of abolitionist petitions on the floor of the House. And then in this amazing, dramatic death, he has a stroke on the floor of Congress after voting against the Mexican War. He's carried to a couch, and his whispered last words are, I am composed, which he gets from Cicero, from the Tusculan Disputations. Remember that passage from Jefferson? The perfectly calm and self-composed man is the virtuous and happy man. It's this extraordinarily mindful example of self-mastery at the moment of death, and it just is more inspiring than anything else in the world. He also, as if that weren't enough, was the first professor of rhetoric at Harvard, and I know you guys have a mandatory rhetoric requirement, which is wonderful, and he viewed the structuring of argument so that reason could temper passion, and you were most persuasive, to be his most important skill. And he wrote a book on rhetoric that that Adams sent to Jefferson as a conciliation gift after they stopped talking after the election of 1800, and then reconciled. And Adams sends Quincy's homespun book on rhetoric. The Adams-Jefferson reconciliation is extremely moving, that they were able, despite having fallen out over the biggest political fissure in American history. The Union almost broke apart in 1800. When they get back together, they bond. What are they bonding over? Books. And I found it incredibly both inspiring and galvanizing to see the fact that these two great men who'd fought the revolution, they get back together, they just want to trade their latest book ideas. And I told you about Adams and Pythagoras, and Jefferson says at the end of his long life, he's become an Epicurean, by which he means not a hedonist. That's a libel on the Epicureans by the Stoics. Instead, it means the rational contraction of desires so that we can meet them. And that's Jefferson's consideration. And it's just a beautiful, inspiring reminder of the transformative power of lifelong reading and learning. The founders, they fell short on so many scores, in particular slavery, but they're still reading and learning until the end of their lives. That's their greatest pleasure. Jefferson says, I've given up newspapers for Tacitus, and I feel much better. And he's so grateful, they both are, to be able to talking about books. And when I think about how hard they had to fight for books, and Adam's not sure whether this guy has lived to create a translation of the Bhagavad Gita, and then I think about the fact that all the books in the world I can now carry on my Kindle, which is where I read, it just blows my mind and fills me with wonder and gratitude for this remarkable age we're living in. And when I was a kid, I went to the Library of Congress with my mom, and I was very young, to the Thomas Jefferson Building. And when you go to DC, you gotta go to the Jefferson Building, because I think it's the most inspiring in DC. And there are these pay-ins to reading, the fountain of wisdom flows through books and authors are the legislators of the world. It's incredibly inspiring. And I just told my mom how exciting it was that all the books in the world were in that beautiful building, and now they're literally on our phones. And all we need is the discipline to read them. And I will now share with you that the biggest takeaway for this project for me was it got me back into the habit of reading. I read in college, I loved being an English major in history and studied with all these wonderful teachers, but I had gotten out of the habit of reading books that weren't related to my deadlines or my work. And just this unusual COVID project of reading every day, my takeaway is that now, when I wake up, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I read. And it takes discipline every morning because I would much rather check the blogs or check my email. But I think of Adams and Jefferson and all those guys, and I just can't swipe right until I did my reading. And it's transformative. It completely changes your life. I've just finished another book on how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson defined all of American history, which was so an amazing topic, and just learn something every day. So I just urge this to you. This is the best takeaway wisdom that I can have, that for the founders, virtue meant the practice of daily habits, and their most important daily habit that they took from being kids was reading, and they just didn't stop, and they thought it was a responsibility to improve themselves and to learn and to grow, and it's also deeply fulfilling. And it ends up, you'd rather have the immediate gratification of checking email, but you just feel better after reading. So I'm an evangelist for the power of deep reading. It's very tough nowadays. People are telling you guys that your generation isn't reading anymore, and it is true that it's alarming because you grew up with screens, but my generation isn't reading anymore either. And we, you guys are busy in college now, we should first look to ourselves, but it's a superpower. And if you can develop it, as I know you are at this great university, because you're here to learn to be good men and good citizens, and practice it every day. Think of Franklin or Adams or Jefferson, and think of it as something daily that you've got to do as a form of your self-accounting. It'll just, it's the one thing you can control in this world where nothing else is in our control, and it will be an endless source of meaning and purpose in your lives. So that's what I got on the reading front. I want to say something now about slavery and the founders, because it's important. How is it possible that these men who insist that virtuous self-mastery and virtues like industry and frugality and temperance are crucial, are enslavers? And what's so striking is that in that generation, they didn't even try. And I found a really striking quotation from Patrick Henry, whose anniversary is next year. And he's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech after quoting from Addison's Cato, another classical play. And he says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I will not justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." It's a remarkable moment of candor and acknowledgement at his own hypocrisy. I know it is wicked, I know it's wrong, but I like the lifestyle and I don't want to give it up. And that was the case for all of the enslavers of that generation. Subsequent enslavers like John Calhoun defended slavery as a positive good. Madison and Jefferson never did. They knew it was wrong, but they liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. And no one more than Jefferson. And it's a sad hypocrisy that the great prophet of human freedom lives at Monticello like a Roman emperor, like Caligula. And he's just a shopaholic, and he's always buying these expensive French furniture, and he is addicted to luxurious living, made possible not only by his enslaved population, but by his own kids. They're the ones who are waiting on him in his own house. And they agreed, Sally Hemings agreed to come back from Paris on the condition that he'd free their kids on his death. He kept that promise, but he freed no other members of his enslaved population except for a few of their Hemings relatives. And as a result, parents are separated from children, and the whole estate is sold to pay his crushing debts. And it's extraordinary that the centerpiece of Jefferson's philosophy is the wickedness of one generation imposing its debts on another. The youth is held in usufruct for the living. And he thinks there has to be a constitutional convention every 19 years to ensure that no generation can bind another. And despite all that, he is so avaricious and so unfrugal and so unindustrious when it comes to this aspect of his life that his crushing debts are all imposed on his daughters. The whole place has to be sold. It's just an example of the fact that no virtue is something that is never obtained. You're always in pursuit of it, and the quest, the pursuit, is the goal, even though you fall short. But some fell much shorter than others, and it's an unfortunate reality that on this crucial question, Jefferson flagrantly and flamboyantly betrayed his own principles. Contrast him with Washington, who becomes even greater on self-examination rather than diminished. Washington's great virtue is self-mastery, and he's constantly struggling to control his temper. People only see his lose his temper twice, once on the battlefield when his orders are disobeyed, and once when he goes to the Senate and they disrespect him and he storms out because he's not given proper respect as president. Ron Chernow, his great biographer, and read the Chernow biography if you haven't, thinks that it may have come from his mom, who, like Abigail Adams, is always nagging him, and he kind of bristles, and he's to try to prevent himself from exploding. He's never seen to lose his temper in public. His greatest moment of self-mastery is at Newburgh. The troops are rebelling, 1784. There's mutiny in the air because they can't be paid. Congress won't vote to grant their back pay. Inflation is high, and there's mutiny in the air. Washington mounts this wooden platform called the Temple of Virtue, and he has performed the play, Addison's Cato, about the consolations of mild philosophy, and then he goes to read the speech that he's composed to pray for temperance and prudence, and says to the troops that they'll just wait, he'll ensure that they're paid. And then he takes out his reading glasses to read the speech and says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the soldiers weep. They've never seen the great Washington confess weakness before. But it's in this moment of studied self-mastery where he's never seemed greater. And that's the source of his authority. He's the most influential figure at the Constitutional Convention. He says almost nothing, but it's the simple power of his authority and the fact that everyone knows that he'll be the first president that allows the Constitution to be ratified. And he gives an example by his forswearing the presidency and going back like Cincinnatus to his farm. One of his favorite authors is Seneca, who's obsessed with time. Seneca says, "Time is a gift repaid by industry. By squandering it, what fools these mortals be." Shakespeare is quoting Seneca. And Washington, as a result, has timepieces everywhere at Mount Vernon. He has his meals and his exercise and his business at the same time every day. He doesn't like to be kept waiting. And it's just another really good practical example for all of us about time's the only thing you can control. Just don't mess it up. Don't squander it. Don't miss your daily reading. Do what you resolve and resolve to do what you ought. And Washington is just the greatest example, and it's just his shining character that makes that possible. It's Washington who makes explicit the connection between personal and political self-government that you're here to learn in your emphasis on being good men and good citizens. Because in his farewell address, he warns that unless the citizens of America can find virtuous self-mastery, they will descend into factions, and the republic will descend into civil war. And he looks at the example of ancient Rome and says that the republic fell because the people descended into faction and exchanged their liberty for cheap luxuries, and Caesar becomes a dictator and consolidates power in his own person, and his successor, Augustus Caesar, offers cheap corn and bread and circuses to the people, and as a result, they allow him to install himself as a dictator for life, and they voluntarily surrender liberty because of faction and a lack of virtuous self-mastery. An unwillingness to set aside their immediate ego-based desires and to tend to the public good. And Washington warns that unless America finds the same virtuous self-mastery, the republic will fall. And that's the precise lesson that Madison and Hamilton embody in the Federalist Papers when they're defending the Constitution. I reread the Federalist Papers under this guise of public happiness, which is a phrase that comes up everywhere. And I came to see the Federalist Papers as a model for how to achieve public happiness through virtuous self-mastery. And this is all obvious in Madison's definition of faction. Some of you remember from Federalist 10, a faction is any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. And Madison is centrally focused on the mobs that are mobbing the federal courthouses in Western Massachusetts at Shays' Rebellion. And he is looking to the failed democracies of Greece and Rome and convinced that in all large assemblies, as he says of the Athenian assembly, of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. The Athenian assembly of 6,000 people is misled by the demagogue Cleon, who convinces the Athenians to invade Sparta. And Madison believes that America has found a solution to the problem of faction. The conventional wisdom is you can only have republics in small territories where people know each other. Madison says that's not necessary when you have representation. You don't have to meet 6,000 people face to face. Madison is also hopeful that the large size of America will make it hard for factions or mobs to mobilize. And by the time they find each other, they'll get tired or go home because it's so hard to travel. But there's one piece of the puzzle that Madison thinks is crucial to make the whole system works, and that's a new media technology, the broadside press. And he's very enthusiastic that once citizens can read arguments like the Federalist Papers in the newspapers and take the time to discuss them with each other and with their constituents, they'll be guided by reason rather than passion, and the slow voice of reason will slowly diffuse across the land. It all hinges on civic education and learning and taking the time to think for yourself and speak as you'd think, not take someone else's word about who to vote for or whether or not to ratify the Constitution, but to read the primary texts so that reason can slowly prevail. And he's not sure that the system is going to succeed. He says we have to achieve the same harmony in the constitution of our mind as we achieve in the constitution of the state. And just as the mind is divided into reason, passion, and desire, so the state has reason in the executive and passion and desire in the House and Senate. And he explicitly compares the harmony of the state constitution with the harmony of the personal constitution, explicitly drawing the connection between being a good man and a good citizen. You see that this is not just an aspiration that your college has wisely embraced as its motto. It's the very centerpiece of the success of the American experiment. And none of them are sure whether or not the experiment will succeed. Washington fears faction. Jefferson accurately predicts civil war and says, "I tremble for my country when I realize that God is just over the question of slavery." Hamilton thinks the executive should be stronger and that you need a president elected for life like Cromwell to resist the importunations of the mob. Adams wants a hereditary president because he fears oligarchs and thinks that people will vote for rich people and celebrities because they'll be seduced, as the Romans were by Caesar. And only Madison's a little more optimistic, but it all hinges on people reading and on this new media technology that will allow slow reason to diffuse across the land. So now, friends, we've got to take a moment to ask, what are we to do in a world that in so many ways is obviously Madison's nightmare? There are the speed bumps and roadblocks that he relied on to ensure the triumph of reason rather than passion are undermined. The large size of America is undermined, obviously, by social media, and the instant speed of communication makes it easy for mobs to mobilize instantly and to calcify. Posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason in a enrage to engage model. And these, 2-minute TikToks are the antithesis of the slow, deep reading that Madison thought was necessary for the Republic to succeed. So each of us, as we've learned from the Stoics, can only control our own thoughts and emotions and habits. So what to do is to start with your own education and self-mastery, and make sure that you're doing that daily reading and thinking and looking at a variety of sources and reading the primary texts, because it's your responsibility, it's your duty as a citizen. And if you don't do it, and if everyone doesn't do it on a large scale, then we're going to go the way of Greece and Rome. And that's what all the ancient confederacies taught, that republics are fragile, they don't last forever, and they can turn on a dime, and they fall when citizens lose the habits of virtuous self-mastery. And think about it for a sec. Suddenly all these virtues that you're learning, to be good men, to be temperate, to be prudent, to be courageous, to be just, to be self-mastered, are the opposite of the virtues rewarded by social media. To be angry, to be extreme, to own the libs or own the conservatives, to tweet your immediate impulses and passions and emotions rather than your thoughtful, long-term deliberation. What's really interesting is that a core way of summing up the ancient wisdom and what it means to be virtuous, it's impulse control. It's resisting your immediate, the gratification of your immediate desires so you can serve your long-term interests and have sober second thoughts and ultimately get outside of serving your own most selfish impulses and serve the public good. There was an experiment at Stanford in the 70s involving the marshmallow test. Kids who are like 5 years old are offered 1 marshmallow if they want to have it right now, and 2 if they can wait 15 minutes. The kids who could wait just did much better later in life. They had better in school and better in their jobs and better people. And that's what we've got to do. Every minute is a version of the marshmallow test. That's what, surfing rather than reading is, and that's what not getting angry immediately and instead trying to cool down. The point is not to overcome emotion. Passion is a synonym for emotion. It's not that you're supposed to lack emotion, but just overcome unproductive emotions. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg told me that her mother told her to overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They will not serve you, and they'll distract you from productive work. And those are the Stoic vices, or anger, ambition, and avarice. And the productive emotions are temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle has a chart. For every emotion or passion, there's an extreme excess and there's a deficiency, and the goal is the golden mean, the moderate middle way. So don't be rash or insensible, be ambitious. And courage rather than hot-headed or weak and so forth. And it's just a good way of thinking about the state that you want to cultivate every day. Sometimes we feel like we're doing the right thing when we're asserting ourselves and showing how tough we are. We're smarter than everyone else. We're stronger. That's just acting out, and it comes from insecurity. What you want is that calm self-mastery that will allow you to just be totally focused and to be master of your own emotions. That's what virtue is. You'll be so much more effective. You'll be better in school. You'll learn more. You'll make political decisions better, and ultimately will be more productive and be able to serve others. There's an amazing fact that when Ben Franklin, at the end of his long life, was asked what he owed his success to, he said it was his temperance, his conciliating spirit. He learned young during that virtue project never to be too self-confident or tendentious, saying, this is the way it is, or my way or the highway. Instead, when expressing opinions, he would say, "It may be so," or "perhaps," or "it occurs to me." And just that simple humility to express himself deftly is what allowed him to broker the Constitutional Convention and ensure near unanimity by bringing the contesting sides together. And isn't it incredible? Ben Franklin, he's the most famous guy in the world at this point, along with Voltaire, the French poet. Franklin has tamed the Gulf Stream and brought lightning from the heavens, and what he thinks is most important for his success is not his brilliant scientific achievements or even the convention. It's his temperance, his conciliating temper, and his virtue. And that's why when Franklin was young, he wanted to start what he called a united party of virtue that would unite young men from across the world to be committed to this project of self-mastery. And he created his own club, a reading group he called the Junto, which means to join. And they would practice that Franklin system for a while every night because they thought that they could be more perfect by, on a daily basis, just reading and discussing and being self-mastered. So that is why it is so great that you're here at this great university. It's why the mission of this university will serve you so well. And it's why it's a quest. And you're never gonna, each day is a new day. And like John Quincy Adams, every day speaking for myself, I feel I'm just making a hash of it. I wasted too much time. I was, on the blogs too long. What am I doing with my life? The goal is not to, you're never gonna come close to being perfect because we're all human. And to be human is to, by definition, fall short of these incredible ideals. But you can become more perfect. And it's very empowering too, because it's all about habits. It's totally within our control. It's deeply empowering. Every day, you messed up yesterday, do better tomorrow. And you have a bad habit of not, solve it and substitute a good one. It's the American idea, it's the American ideal, it's defined our politics and our whole sensibility for so much of our history. It's incredible that it just fell out of pop culture in the 1950s, and happiness came to be seen as feeling good rather than being good, and we just lost this classical understanding, and that's why it's so important that you have it here, because it's like a superpower. You're learning something that people experienced as the key to flourishing and the good life throughout history, that's not celebrated in pop culture today, but it remains as true today as it ever was. So that's why I'm so honored to be here and would love to have a conversation with you about the pursuit of happiness. Thank you so much. Just checking the time, but.
Does a student want to jump in first? That was terrific. And I take it you're familiar with Madison's observation that by nurturing Republican manners, we acquire rational dignity. Fits in perfectly with what you had to say. As you know, the founders thought teleologically. They worked backwards from their end. Their end was to nurture a certain kind of human being, a certain kind of citizens. And then they thought about, well, what kind of republic or political community would give us the best shot at nurturing those citizens. And I'm sure that if you had your way, every public official would proceed with the understanding of the founding and the work of the founders that you have described this evening. So let's put some meat on the bones. I'm a legislator, and you're advising me, and you have this understanding of the founders and what the founders wanted for us. And I need to decide whether to attach a work requirement to welfare benefits. Or I need to decide whether to toughen up the punishments associated with certain violations of our laws. What advice, based upon getting the kinds of citizens that the founders were looking to nurture, would you give to that legislator with regard to those kinds of public policy issues?
Wonderful question, and your quotation from Madison is so apt. The founders disagreed fundamentally on matters of policy. And that's what I learned from this new book about Hamilton and Jefferson. The initial Hamilton and Jefferson debate over the question of national power versus states' rights, liberal versus strict construction of the Constitution, and democracy versus rule by elites has defined all of our political parties and all of our debates on the Supreme Court ever since. And the questions you mentioned are ones that Madison and Hamilton, like the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and the Democrats and Republicans, might plausibly disagree about history, throughout history. There's no right answer to those questions of welfare or punishment. But what there is a right answer to is the urgent need to educate legislators and all of us about the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And although you can agree or disagree about whether or not to have the death penalty, you cannot, if a republic is going to survive, agree about whether or not the president is a king, or to have an independent judiciary, or the importance of the separation of powers, or the need to reject efforts to suppress speech of dissenters and journalists. And that's why throughout, at moments of crucial crisis in America, our great leaders have reminded us that unless we educate ourselves in the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, we'll have civil war. Because the one thing standing between America and violence is principle. There's this great letter from John Adams to John Quincy Adams. He says, I've been reading the history plays of Shakespeare, from Richard II to Richard III in the 13th and 14th centuries. And it's a story of faction and death and the red rose and the white rose. And the one thing standing between England and violence is constitutional principle, is the Magna Carta and habeas corpus. And when that's abandoned, then violence results. And that's the central lesson of American history. When we abandon the principles of the Constitution and the Declaration, violence results. In the Civil War with Lincoln, with the mobs of Springfield that he was denouncing, with the mobs all the way up to today. And the barely suppressed violence we're seeing today is a norm, not an exception in American history. I'll just end by, saying, what would you say to a legislature? There's this incredible speech from John Quincy Adams where he is channeling the Puritan Jeremiads, the denunciation of the congregation for falling short of divine ideals and breaking the covenant, and says that, unless we keep the principles of the Declaration, we're going to go the way of Greece and Rome and surrender our liberties and empower demagogues to become dictators. And then Quincy Adams quotes Deuteronomy, and he says, make these principles as frontlets between your eyes, bind them up on your hands and on your arms, whisper them to your children before you sleep, make them the principles of your political salvation. It's just astonishing. That's how serious it is and how important it is that all of us learn these principles, which are not intuitive. It's important that you're studying history at this great university, but the principles of the Constitution, as well as the practice of self-government, requires study, and the way to do it is to learn from history. We've got to study American history in all of its complexity and all of its messiness, and see how fragile the experiment is, and see when it's fallen and when it hasn't, and that hopefully will inspire us to move forward.
Can I follow up with that?
Of course.
And I don't know that this might put you on the spot. I'm not looking to put you on.
I'm ready to be here.
Washington's reaction to the Whiskey Rebellion,
Yes.
was that an inescapable policy decision based upon the reasoning that you set out this evening, was it inescapable?
No, great question, great question.
Did he have options?
Of course he had options. Nothing is inescapable. History is completely contingent, and had he not wisely mediated between the bellicose position of Hamilton, who literally wants to get on a horse leading the charge so that he can shore up his political career and brutally put down the rebellion, and that of Jefferson, who says that it's good for the blood of tyrants to be energized by revolution every few years and basically wants to let the guys off. Washington, initially he gets in a carriage. He has to ride in the carriage because he has a bad back, so he can't be on horse and display himself the whole time. And the only sitting president to command an army goes to initially, in the initial skirmishes, just to display himself. That display of federal authority is enough to basically make the rebels back off with relatively few casualties. But the crucial thing is that afterward, he pardons them. And it is his clemency, that combination of firmness with mercy, of strictness with moderation, that just makes him greater than every other man of his time.
First of all, I just want to say that was a really powerful lecture that you gave, and I found that you articulated a lot of the values that I try to hold in my life a lot better than I could have myself. I wanted to ask you, if we were to try to explain what you set out, the values, the pursuit of self-virtue, the value of temperance, if we were to try to help others to come to the same conclusions that you've come to and explain these ideas, what sort of techniques, what sort of conversations do you think we should try to have?
It's an important individual quest, and everyone gets there in their own way. I'll just share that for me, it has been essentially a spiritual quest. And when I was in college, I wasn't raised with a religious background, and I was looking for a way to the wisdom through reading. And I read the Bible, and I read the Eastern traditions too, and read the Stoics, and it was something, I was at a stage in my life when seeing the incredible similarities between them, and the fact that all of these great books essentially had the same message about virtuous self-mastery through temperance and self and self-mastery, made me realize that ultimately is an attempt to connect to the divine, and that the injunctions of the Bible to be perfect as Jesus is perfect, or the Old Testament to be slow to anger, are in fact within our control. That it's a real philosophy of self-empowerment. It's not impossible. None of us will be as perfect as Jesus, but we can try to be as our best selves every day. And that it's a daily process. And realizing I guess I'd say that it became a feeling as much as something intellectual. I could read it in books or be told to embrace this by a religious tradition, but it's the actual practice of the virtues. It becomes a habit, and then there's a kind of, when you're in alignment and you're focused and you're actually being your most productive self, you feel better, first of all. That's the takeaway from all this. It does ultimately make you happier, but it provides the purpose because the quest is in the practice. So that's not a very crisp answer. You can't just tell people how to, everyone's got to find it on their own. Some people find it through, many people find it through faith and through their church or their religious tradition. Some find it through meditation or mindfulness, or others in other forms. For me, it was just seeing how all the different traditions get to the same place that did it. And I'll just stress once again, you got to have a practice. And that's why this takeaway of reading, this is a big change. I'm doing it every morning, and I have got to stress, I'm not catching the sunrise every morning. I don't want to be a virtue monger to pretend that I'm doing it all the time. Although if you can do it, there's nothing more beautiful in the world than the sunrise. So it's just I got it this morning, and it's just a privilege. The day is better when you catch it. But that's what, those are among the things I'd suggest. But let me ask you, how would you do it? How would you talk to people about it? And when you tell them what you're studying here and how you're trying to be a good person, what do you say?
I suppose that the value that you explained that I identified the most with was temperance. And I think that that's something that is very lost in the world today, and that most people you talk to are very impulsive and make decisions in that split second. When it comes into their head, they don't take time to think through ideas and other points of view. And I think that if I were to try to explain, what you talked about today, I think I would probably focus on that point more than anything, because I think that is probably the most valuable thing that we could contribute to, or help other people, contribute to our society, is just that virtue of temperance.
Beautiful. I really think you put your finger on, first of all, the central virtue for Franklin. For the ancients, too, temperance embodied all the other ones of prudence, courage, and justice. And as you say, it's not intuitive. We celebrate the opposite in every aspect of pop culture and politics. I was amazed to see there's some happiness course at Yale or some fancy university, and the teacher was telling the students, go out and get angry. That was the takeaway. Get angry about something. That's the opposite of virtue. It's not effective to go out and get angry. Anyone can get angry and yell and scream and, even protest is fine, but an ineffective, angry protest is not effective. But the idea that temperance is not just some mushy compromise or some kumbaya, let's get along thing. It is an urgent and difficult and arduous virtue that is necessary to cultivate if you're actually going to be effective and self-mastered, as well as serving others and being happy. That's the secret. And you're right that it's worth talking about that and talking about the history of it. And then when you also seek something else. You're not trying to get through every day with exuberant highs and lows and thinking that the key is just to, just feel that elation, that immoderate elation, that it's that calm tranquility actually that you're most powerful. There's this moment when the Constitution is ratified, the citizens of Philadelphia are going to celebrate. They'll dress up in classical costumes. They're carrying these, togas and stuff. But they're totally silent because they're embodying the classical virtue of rational joy. Can you imagine? Next week, citizens, go to the polls, embody rational joy, quietly and silently celebrate. We're just so far from that idea. But that's how seriously they took that notion. Happiness is not, you do you, but moderate elation. All of these ideas are no longer familiar, but they're crucial, and it's great to bring them back.
Yes, sir. So you've spoken of Washington as the greatest man of his time, and probably the best of his generation as embodying civic virtue. Who would you say did studies that seem to have completely disregarded civic virtue? Is there any more that you came across who was not a good role model in this class?
Well, I mean, the ones that I picked great and influential people, but the ones that fell most short, certainly Jefferson on slavery, there's no question. And Jefferson, I have to, since you ask, in addition to being a hypocrite, he was also even more of a racist than the other enslavers. And there's this awful, I talk about his encounters with Phyllis Wheatley, who's the first published black poet. And she's acclaimed by Washington, who calls her a genius, and she becomes the Oprah Winfrey of her time because she's an international celebrity. Jefferson disses her in the Notes of the State of Virginia. He basically says she's black and black people are intellectually inferior, so they can't be good poets. It's a kind of degree of racism that is disappointing even by the standards of his time. And then there are others, like really great founders like James Wilson, who was the guy who came up with the idea of popular sovereignty, that we the people of the United States as a whole are sovereign rather than we the people of the individual states. So the preamble is his idea. He wants popular election of the president. He's a professor of constitutional law. He's a Supreme Court justice, but his vice is he's incredibly in debt. He does land speculation. He goes totally broke. He's in a debtor's prison while he's on the Supreme Court, and he dies on the lam being pursued by his creditor, Pierce Butler, who's one of the big planters out here, and he has malarial fever and his wife is mopping his brow, and his last words are, "At least I was industrious." You know, because he's so he's also been reading the virtues, like he's such a classicist, but he couldn't help himself because and land speculation also ruined Robert Morris, the financier of the revolution. The main money guy of his time was also in debtor's prison. So those vices, which are and the classical people say always that what ruins people is avarice, ambition, and greed. So the fact that Jefferson was, didn't want to give up the lifestyle and Wilson did land speculation, these are all the things that ruined men throughout history, and they were as prone to that as everyone else. Since you asked me, I'll stop, but if there's a single figure in American history, you said who's the really bad one? In Hamilton, Jefferson, of course, the villain is Burr, and it's so amazing that both Hamilton and Jefferson believe that Burr is a demagogue who's both conspiring to lead a separatist movement in the West, and also, according to testimony at the trial, lead a march on Washington, D.C., hang Jefferson, those are words that people testified Burr used, and install himself as dictator in D.C. So he's the kind of cautionary tale throughout American history.
So, first of all, thank you for speaking. I thought that was a very good message to send. My question is, you spoke a lot about the very well-known, influential, intellectual men of the time. And I think you did go into some of this, but could you perhaps please expound a little on the efforts they took to emphasize this ideal to the rest of the population and how successful that was? Because, as you mentioned with the rebellion, it seemed to dissolve this nationalism quite quickly.
That's a really crucial question. The Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians disagree about how possible it is to achieve education and virtue on a mass democratic scale. And the Jefferson and Madison really do believe that you can expand the franchise for white men and achieve democratic self-mastery, and Hamilton and Adams think that it's more for elites, and they fear democracy and want to check it at every turn. If I may, I'm going to answer the question by saying that you didn't need a classical education to get this wisdom, and the best example of this, which for me is totally inspiring, is Frederick Douglass. And Douglass, the moment he feels most enslaved is when his wicked master forbids him from learning how to read. So he goes onto the streets of Baltimore, he buys reading lessons with bread, he pays boys to teach him how to read, and then he buys with bread this book called The Columbian Orator, which is the best-selling kind of textbook of its time. It started in the early 19th century and it remained a bestseller until the early 20th century. It has selections from the classical wisdom, from Seneca and the Stoics, from Ben Franklin, a dialogue on slavery. I mention that because the American tradition is this is not just education for people who go to great, to fancy universities or to any universities. People like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and school kids throughout American history got it from these primers, these basic McGuffey readers and things like that, which even my mom, who graduated in 1950 from New York City Public School, read, and then it kind of fell out. So I say that to say I am a complete believer that this is a democratic wisdom that anyone can pick up just from these little selections. And think of Douglass, what he sacrificed to buy and read this book. Lincoln, who had to borrow books from a local farmer, and then when they got ruined in the rain, pull corn to pay for them. It was so tough for them to have access to books. Just these tiny little selections inspired their lives. We've got all the books right here. Let's read them.
I wanted to say thank you. I thought that was a really beautiful speech. I also wanted to ask, do you think the instinctual appeal to virtue and discipline is something that is more integral on like a virtue, something that is more instilled on a societal basis.
That's such a great question. And there was a big, of course, debate about this among the philosophers. And Locke thinks that we're born as blank slates and that everything is imprinted through our external impressions and experiences. And a guy called Francis Hutcheson, Scottish guy, channeling Cicero, thinks we have an innate or hardwired moral sense that can basically guide our decisions and that all people are born with it, and that inclines us to empathy, and it can aid reason in subjugating passion. They all disagree about whether or not reason is strong enough to subdue or moderate passions, and some of them think that this conscience or hardwired moral sense will help. I attended a wonderful class today where you were reading Socrates' Apology, and Socrates talks about his demon or good spirit who always guided him in telling him what the right thing was to do. And he, like Cicero, seemed to believe that that was hardwired rather than totally taught. Still, since you asked whether or not there's a hardwired moral sense, culture has a huge amount to do with it, as evidenced by the fact that I didn't know about this old definition of happiness because pop culture totally rejected it. And starting in the 60s, we began to exalt all the opposite things. And it's totally unfamiliar. It seems like something from a different planet, reminding us how important culture is, and also reminding us that Adams said that the revolution began in the American mind. It was once citizens were persuaded to embrace this idea of virtuous self-mastery that they could throw off their shackles and demand liberty.
So you talked about these kind of foundational philosophies to our founding fathers, like Epicureanism and Stoicism. And these are both very inward-looking philosophies. For instance, Epicurus said that basically you shouldn't involve yourself with politics because it's not worth the stress it would cause you. How do you think we can get these idea of being involved in politics, the civic virtue, elements of encouraging right behavior in your neighbors out of these philosophies and kind of match them with right passion?
Great question, really important. And it's true that there is a obvious and central focus on self-mastery and controlling the only thing you can control in Stoicism and the classics. They don't neglect the common good by any means, and especially the Roman versions of it through Cicero and the popularizers emphasizes that the point of self-mastery is so that you can serve the res publica and can look beyond your own immediate ego-based interests and devote yourself to the common good. And in fact, there's a Stoic obligation of benevolence that you're supposed to practice. So how do we do it? I mean, I guess let's try to think like Romans, and we're going to get really serious about this. At every time, subjugate our immediate interests so that we can serve the common good. Adams wonders, he's kind of half joking, and says maybe we should resurrect sumptuary laws which forbid people from spending too much on luxuries, the way ancient Rome did. And then he laughs and says this will lead people to, snicker nowadays because no one actually wants them. But in the extreme form, Adams thought that to make a republic work, you had to be as ascetic as Spartan soldiers and live together in common dining rooms and exercise every day together and practice self-mastery and not surf or, buy too many YouTube videos and basically be totally devoted to the state. So obviously, as even Adams recommended, that's not reasonable. If you're asking me seriously what to do, I just am such an evangelist for the urgent importance of making up your own mind on questions. So what I would say, there are many ways to do it. The Constitution Center, which I have the great honor of working at, was created by Congress to bring together liberals and conservatives to explore agreement and disagreement about every part of the Constitution. So there are these amazing resources like the podcast I do every week, interviewing liberals and conservatives about current issues. The interactive Constitution that's gotten 90 million hits. It brings together leading liberals and conservatives to debate every clause of the Constitution, just as Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal with 1,000 words about the habeas corpus clause and separate statements about what they disagree about. A Constitution 101 class we've just launched with Khan Academy, with everything you need to know about the Constitution, and primary texts, so you can read them and make up your own mind. And I'm giving you this plug for the NCC, because I think you really have a responsibility to educate yourself about these issues, both before you vote and also before you talk about politics, because these are complicated issues. I'm not saying before you decide what you think about policy issues, but you can't have an informed opinion about whether or not the Second Amendment forbids or allows concealed carry, the issue in the Bruin case, unless you got to read the Supreme Court opinion, read the majority opinion, read the dissent, and that's just the beginning. Then you've got to read the briefs or learn about some of the history and maybe some of the commentary. Always go back to the primary sources. What I'm saying is take the time to be an informed citizen, and then in a thoughtful, informed way, you can canvass or vote for whoever you want, or try to with the with the Republicans or Democrats on campus, hold events. But then you won't be just acting like a faction and repeating talking points and just doing the same kind of villainization and factionalization that we all know is totally messing up politics. You'll actually be thinking for yourself, and I think it'll allow you, I'll bring this home finally, to the degree that you do act in politics and you organize and you vote, try to convince your side not to be acting in a factionate, selfish, brutal way, which is going to mess up our democracy. And both sides are completely guilty of this extremism and thoughtlessness, and don't buy into that. And if you're a politician, this is very difficult because all of the votes are going to come from firing up your base. And if you're a moderate, you're going to get hammered. And it's poignant. Study the examples of the people in Congress who have broken ranks, Republicans who voted for Democrats or vice versa. They've gotten hammered, they've gotten primaried because of the political system. It's very, very hard to survive. And that leads to the question of, are there any structural reforms that could address some of these issues? And I'm sorry to report there are no easy reforms. Some big ones that people have identified include reforming the presidential primary system. It wasn't until the 70s that we had direct primaries, and that's led to the most extreme candidates appealing to the most energized bases, and elections have gotten much more polarized since then. Reform within Congress that would re-empower the committee system, so people have to negotiate with the other side rather than just having leadership push everything through. And some think that some gerrymandering or electoral reform like ranked choice voting elects more moderate candidates. Those are just some, but there's no silver bullet. None of these are easy to implement. But thinking about issues in these constitutional and structural terms is helpful, because these are very serious times, as we all know, regardless of who wins this election. And we're not going to fix our political ailments easily. But you have an ability to just be deeper and more thoughtful about these issues than other people by studying history, by studying political science, by taking the time to seek out the people who are thinking thoughtfully about this and to make a contribution to our republic. Maybe one more question, yeah.
So is it possible for the government to encourage these civic or personal virtues through means of legislation without becoming overly tyrannical? It doesn't have to be like a purely personal endeavor.
In America, centralized education mandates have just failed. They just don't work. The Common Core and No State Left Behind are the most recent examples of very well-intentioned curriculum that aren't even that prescriptive and just got hammered because states don't like to be told what to do. And we're seeing at the state level the really troubling and illiberal actions by conservative and progressive legislatures trying to tell people what to teach that both raise constitutional issues and just suggest that, again, they're well-intentioned. I understand where both sides are coming from, but having the government tell people what to teach is not a good idea. There is a broad consensus in theory that civics are important. Happily, the left and the right in theory thinks that. And with the NCC and a lot of other great nonprofits, including Mount Vernon and Monticello and Montpelier and historic sites are doing to lead up to America's 250, are creating free civic resources that schools will be able to adopt and want to adopt because they're totally nonpartisan. And we're creating this great civic toolkit in collaboration with Ken Burns, who has this great, incredible American Revolution documentary, which is launching next year, that'll teach the basic principles of the Declaration and the Constitution: liberty, equality, democracy, separation of powers, federalism, the Bill of Rights, videos with great historians, primary sources, source materials for discussion, and try to provoke discussions around the country like that. I've been really moved talking about this book around the country. It's resonating. Who would have thought that a book on classical writers on virtue would resonate? But it's resonating because people know that they have gotten out of the reading habit and are sharing their own habits of reading, and also are hungry for deep historical content. And I'll just end with two really moving experiences I had in Elkhart, Indiana, and Cooksville, Tennessee, where a guy in Elkhart brought 500 over 50 retirees together in the local church to talk about the virtues and the pursuit of happiness. And people were sharing, these are over 50 retirees, their own daily morning practices, sometimes prayer, sometimes creative work like music, poetry, reading. People are seeking the same thing you're all seeking now and trying to learn as young men how to be good men and good citizens. That doesn't go away. It becomes all the more important when you're later in life. And just having a framework to talk about these issues involving history and philosophy and the virtues in a nonpartisan way that doesn't involve politics. And I do not think that political discussions are all that productive at this point, because people are not going to convince each other about what the right policy is. But we can absolutely bond and learn together about American history. And then you guys are lucky because you're learning it in college, but you can share your experiences with, as you get older, with all the, fellow citizens who are coming to it later in life and bond over that. Franklin dreamt of a united party for virtue that would unite citizens across the country into these kind of reading groups and discussion groups. That's just what we're trying to create for America's 250. I'm so honored to have made this connection and hope we'll continue to do stuff together, and just wish you every enthusiasm and sending every good wish for learning and light for your own individual journeys for self-mastery. Thank you so much.